So hello and welcome to another video in the series, or the key concept series, that we are currently looking at here on YouTube and on my blog. Today we're going to be looking at the life of Hegel and the key concepts that relate to Hegel. And we're going to do something a little bit different today. As you can see, I've got someone else joining me in the corner, which is Sean Ledwith. How are you doing, Sean?
Hi, Reese. Looking forward to it.
So Sean's kind of a pseudo expert, would you not say, on Hegel?
Pseudo expert.
Sorry, I meant to say a pure expert on Hegel, of course. It's a pure expert on Hegel, so he's actually going to be helping us out with the lecture today, which we're looking at breaking up into two series. So we've got the first video where we're going to introduce some key foundations which Hegel builds off of, relating to the Enlightenment and the historical context. And in the second video, we're going to take a deeper look into Hegel's theory and what those key concepts actually are. If you're interested in anything else that you want us to look at, or anything else that we've done, feel free to follow my blog, which is Reese Gustinski over at WordPress. And then Sean also writes regularly and is are you one of the founding members of Counterfire?
No, I can't claim that on
it. But regularly writes for Counterfire. You also write book reviews as well, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So philosophical ones. There was one on Gramsci recently, wasn't there?
Yeah, that's right. So if you go on Counterfire, you'll see links to other sort of sites that I've written for as well.
Excellent. So I'll link those in the description if anyone's interested, so we can take a look. So let me introduce you to what we're going to be looking at in this first video. So the first thing that we're going to discuss is we're going to talk about the life and legacy of Hegel. And Sean's going to elaborate on that, because online Hegel very much has this relationship that he's a boring or impenetrable philosopher, but Sean will convince you that that is not the case. And in fact, together we will both convince you that that is not the case, and that Hegel is essential for any kind of reading of philosophy, particularly in the 21st century. We're then going to take a look at Hegel's philosophical foundations. So we'll take a look at the role of the Enlightenment, the debates of empiricism versus rationalism. We've got a little bit of Kant in there as well. And then we're going to look at the historical transition from feudalism to capitalism, and where Hegel fits into that, and how his ideas build off these concepts. And then finally, we're going to do a brief introduction to some Hegelian concepts too. So without further ado, let's get into this. So we'll make a start. I suppose before we start, really, I'd like to come to you, Sean, and actually ask, a lot of people critique Hegel as an idealist, or they think that him being an idealist means we don't really have to pay much attention to what he's saying. So I don't know what you would say to that, or in response to that, or why you think Hegel being an idealist is important.
I think it's a terrible simplification to call Hegel an idealist, really, because the standard definition of idealism is this idea that the world of ideas is the driving force and the world of materiality is secondary. I think the thing to understand about Hegel is that Hegel sees the world of ideas and the world of the material as actually ultimately identical. So the idea that Hegel sort of downgrades or downplays the sort of physical material world is really a misunderstanding. It's true to call Hegel an idealist in the sense that it does say that ideas matter, and that ideas do play a crucial role in terms of the operations of the physical world. But to call Hegel a pure idealist in the sense that, let's say, a classic idealist with someone like Berkeley, who argue that basically the physical world is only held in place by God thinking. You know, that's a real sort of pure form of idealism, and Hegel is not that sort of idealist. Hegel is arguing that ultimately the world of ideas and the physical world are actually on the same level, and that to understand them both, you need to see them as crucially interconnected. So I think the standard definition of Hegel as an idealist is a simplification ultimately, but hopefully that'll make a bit more sense at the end of this.
Yeah, hopefully. I mean, personally, I don't see there being anything wrong with an idealist, given we're about to hit a huge financial crisis. Many people are looking for answers. That philosophy is actually becoming more popular as a result of this crisis that we've been through. And you would have thought Hegel being an idealist is someone that we would need to look to. What sort of new future could we create as a result of that?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that there's two ways of defining what idealism is. There's idealism in our everyday sense, in terms of optimism and hope for the future. And in that sense, yes, Hegel is an idealist. I mean, I was just talking about in the sort of strict epistemological sense. I don't think he is an idealist, but like you say, in terms of our contemporary situation, then I do think actually Hegel does offer us a route forward. Actually, not just Hegel, but I think his way of thinking, his sort of fundamentally dialectical approach, does offer a route out of this sort of situation.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree as usual. Now, you might recognize this picture. No, it's not us talking in the pub. But Hegel has this reputation of being boring, and we can see we've included this meme which circulates a lot online, where you've got someone holding up Hegel's phenomenology of spirit at a party, and the party kind of stopping and going silent. And I wondered what you kind of had to say to those people who think Hegel is boring, and why we should engage with Hegel as a philosopher.
I think part of it is to do with if you think about the sort of the cultural educational world that we're in, the English speaking world. There's always been an antipathy to Hegel, and I think that we are partly the victims of that. Whereas if you look in the rest of Europe, particularly France and Germany, they almost take Hegel in with the mother's milk. Basically, he's regarded as an essential thinker. So I think again, once we've gone through this, the centrality of Hegel for trying to understand the modern world, I think it is really something that everyone can benefit from. So it's really, like, you're totally right. Hegel does have a very grim reputation in the English-speaking world, but I think there are historical reasons for that, which we can go into a bit later.
Excellent, good. And I think just building off that as well, I mean, he's been so influential on philosophy and modern history in general too. I mean, people like Foucault say it's almost impossible not to bump into him along the road to any kind of philosophical discussion. He's obviously a huge influence on Vladimir Lenin, who very rightly argues that you can't understand Marx without understanding Hegel. So I think in that sense, it's hard to call him boring for someone who's been so essential on 21st century history and the history of ideas.
Yeah, I think the antipathy for Hegel comes from his complexity, but I think we need to get away from the idea. Okay, someone's complex, so let's not engage with that person. I think the reality is that the world we are in, almost day by day, becomes incredibly more complex and incredibly more challenging. And I think Hegel offers us a sort of a breadth and a vision that you don't really get from any other thinkers. And I think it's his ambition that always strikes me. He does set out to explain everything, and you can argue he doesn't succeed, and that's a vain project anyway. But I think that this attempt to try and think of a way of thinking that embraces the whole, I think what Hegel calls the sheer restlessness of life, the unpredictability. It's easy to get sort of ground down and drowned by the sometimes the overwhelming nature of what's around us. Whereas I think an Hegelian approach does offer us a way of trying to get a handle on what's actually going on.
Absolutely. And hopefully by the end of this video, you'll sympathise with the other meme that we've put up there of Hegel actually being more of a Chad figure than this kind of maligned figure in the history of, well, mainly the West, really, or Hegel's relation in the West, which, as Sean rightly says, is quite different to that of continental Europe. So let's get into it. So I don't know if you want to take us through the history first, Sean, and then we'll skip on and we'll take a look at some philosophical foundations.
Yeah, so I think it is useful to have a look at Hegel's life, Hegel's life and times, and that there is this myth that Hegel was basically a dull guy, nothing ever happened to him. That's partly why he's got this dull, unreadable, impenetrable philosophy. So I think part of the way of trying to get into Hegel is if you look at his actual life experience, it was full of contradictions, it was full of tumult. And that, in some ways that possibly feeds into his actual philosophy. So some things that stand out for me is that his sister Christiane, she was obsessed with him, as soon as he came into the world, basically. I'm sure Freud could tell us a lot about this, but she had this psychological obsession with him. There was really so much that when he finally decided to get married, she couldn't cope with it, basically, and she ended up killing herself 2 weeks after his death, simply because she couldn't cope with him. And she ended up being put in an asylum. So obviously, you can read too much into these things, but this is clearly not a dull guy, someone who other people can obsess about. There's clearly something in his personality. I think other things that are quite one of the most notable events in his life, we'll see a little image of it later on, is 1806 when he publishes one of his key texts, which is the Phenomenology of Spirit. In 1806, he's actually in the German city of Jena when it's been besieged by Napoleon's forces, and Napoleon's forces are bombarding the city, and basically Hegel has to do a runner with a copy of the manuscript of Phenomenology of Spirit. And you might think that someone whose city was being bombarded by a besieging force would not really be a huge fan of the besieging force. But you have this remarkable episode where Hegel essentially welcomes Napoleon's army into Jena and actually sees Napoleon in person and sees it as a hugely significant event and something that Hegel welcomes. I mean, I think in some ways that, you know, the one key idea for Hegel is contradiction, and you know his whole life is full of contradictions in a way. You know, this idea of actually welcoming the commander of the army that's put your life in peril, it sort of sums him up in a way.
I quite like that connection between his personal life and his actual theories as well. And I think sometimes, because I've done that on previous videos that we've done on the channel, and I just think sometimes it says a lot or can deepen the understanding you have of the thinker.
That's right. Yeah, I think it does give you a sort of a way into where ideas come from, because I think there's a very sort of ahistorical approach to philosophy sometimes. You know, these ideas just come out of the ether, whereas I think you really do have to situate Hegel into the wider historical context, but also in terms of his own biography as well. Does also help give you a starting point to his ideas, basically. So in terms of his own personality, again, the fact that he got into this relationship with the landlady's daughter, who was 20 years his junior, you know, that this is a man who's got some level of appeal to other people. Whereas again, you know, although you know you put the sunglasses on the picture, which is good. I mean, that sort of standard image.
So he's more of a Chad than people making out to be. I mean, he's got his own sister fawning after him. He's knocking up the landlady.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, the thing is, there's not many pictures of Hegel smiling, but I think if you read his biography, Hegel was actually a real fun guy. People did like to be around him. He did have a reputation for having a drink and having a good time. So I think in terms of, I think what we're trying to do today is blow away a lot of the sort of mythology about Hegel. And I think talking about his personality, his biography, in terms of actually being quite interesting in itself, is a good starting point. So the woman that he had the affair with, you know, she was on his case inevitably for a significant period of time. So eventually, when he did get married, the landlady's daughter, he had to sort of pay her off. So there's no personal scandal in Hegel's life. Usually when you think about Hegel, you don't think about personal scandal, but there clearly was something going on. And then in terms of the rest of his family, so it wasn't just himself who was a huge fan of Napoleon. His brother actually enlisted in Napoleon's army, went off to fight in Russia and ended up dying. The son of his affair with the landlady's daughter, now the thing is that Hegel, you know, had two families. You know, his what you might call his step family and his original biological son. He did actually try to bring the two families together in a way that's quite progressive at the time. But you know, his personal relationship with that first son was a problematic one, and again, rather sort of strangely, Hegel wanted to try and force this poor boy into the German army. But this boy ended up running away and ended up dying of disease in the East Indies. And then the other thing is, I think, you know, in terms of, you know, Hegel when you read Hegel on the page, it can come across as very dense. But you know, there's evidence that as a lecturer, as a teacher, he was actually hugely popular and hugely appealing. So you know, when he was at University of Berlin, sort of final stage of his career, there were huge queues of people to get in. Sort of standing room only sort of thing.
Not even that, his own followers afterwards as well.
Yeah, totally.
So he must have been a kind of a big personality in that sense.
Yeah, I think there's no doubt he sort of dominated German thinking, and you know, that ultimately ends up dominating European thinking. I mean, there's a famous story about one of his great philosophical rivals was Schopenhauer, and Schopenhauer had no time.
We love a bit of Schopenhauer.
So Schopenhauer deliberately tried to timetable his lessons opposite Hegel, But of course, nobody went to Schopenhauer because Hegel was the man of the moment. That probably didn't help Schopenhauer's pessimistic view of the world.
What's that favourite quote? Today is bad, and every day it gets worse until the inevitable.
Yeah, that's definitely very relevant these days. So then they got this guy called Holden, one of his sort of friends from his youth, and Holden had a sort of mental breakdown which affected him a huge amount of his life, basically. But even when Hegel's death was announced to Holden, and even though Holden was essentially insane, there was still he still recognised the name of Hegel, and he still recognised the concept of the absolute idea, and it sort of it really cut through even to Holden in his real sort of personal pit of despair. So I think overall Hegel comes across as a very powerful personality. Which again is a million miles away from this image of him as a complete party pooper.
Absolutely. Just before we move on, because I think you articulated that pretty well. Do you want to expand on the situation with Napoleon just a little further? Because we've got this nice quote here. I saw the emperor, this world soul, riding out of the city on reconnaissance. It is indeed a wonderful sensation to see such an individual who, concentrated here at a single point, astride a horse, reaches out over the world and masters it. So I didn't know if you wanted to expand on that quote.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a very interesting insight into how Hegel sees what he calls. So Hegel had this idea that certain people, such as Napoleon, Alexander, Julius Caesar, or the Cromwell, these personalities embodied as what today we call the zeitgeist. But for Hegel, it's obviously much more. It's a more complex idea which we can go into. But for Hegel, history operates on one level by certain personalities driving it forward. So Napoleon was essentially the embodiment of the French Revolution. So when Hegel actually saw Napoleon turning up in Jena, Hegel saw this as the French Revolution, the ideas of the French Revolution, the progressive ideas of the French Revolution, sort of impacting in Germany. And of course, Germany was historically and culturally and economically behind France, but and not even a united political entity, which Hegel wanted it to be. So Hegel really welcomed Napoleon's arrival as, again, history making a leap forward in a way. Now, I think it's pretty unlikely that Napoleon recognized Hegel, but certainly Hegel saw Napoleon as this embodiment of this world spirit. I think the other interesting thing is that Hegel doesn't argue that people like Napoleon understood that they were part of what he called, the dialectic of history. He has this idea, we can talk about later on, what Hegel calls the cunning of reason. So people like Julius Caesar and Alexander and Napoleon, they are more or less unaware of what role they play in history, but that doesn't stop them playing an important role. I mean, I think Cromwell had this famous line about the person who doesn't know where he's going travels furthest. And I think that's a similar idea, actually. These sort of personalities, although they dominated their time, for Hegel, the real importance is that they embody the absolute idea pushing history forward. And so the danger of this, of course, is it can lead into the classical great man view of history, that only individuals matter. But I think that this is not Hegel's view. These individuals matter because they embody the spirit of the times. Someone like Napoleon, if he'd been around 100 years earlier or 200 years earlier, he would have been a nobody. It's only because he's in the right place at the right time that he's able to seize the historical moment. So I think this moment of Hegel meeting Napoleon is really one of the great moments of the 19th century, really.
Absolutely. It's quite interesting comparing his view of great leaders with Nietzsche, who we've discussed before, whose position on history is that it's kind of presented as if we'll never meet these great leaders again, as opposed to using history as something to move to the future. So it's quite an interesting comparison, because of course Nietzsche was another kind of anti-Hegelian, whilst owing, I think, at least some debt to Hegel, regardless.
Yeah, I think Nietzsche is very much amongst those who react negatively against Hegel, but like I say, he is shaped by Hegel's view. I think the other thing about this idea of individuals is that I think for Nietzsche, great individuals, they shape history according to their will, whereas I think the Hegelian view is actually history uses these individuals according to its will. I mean, I think, for Hegel almost thinks about history as an entity in itself. So I think they're right. There is a similarity between the Nietzsche and the Hegelian view in terms of focusing on the role of individuals, but they do end up with a different conclusion in terms of which matters most, the individual or the historical spirit.
Yeah, I think that's a really important distinction too, and an important distinction to make. So let's move on. Let's talk a little bit about the philosophical background of Hegel and kind of what he's building off, or his ideas are building off. So this idea of empiricism versus rationalism had kind of dominated philosophy pretty much up to the point where Kant comes along, or Kant's revolution. Now, the idea of empiricism is the idea that the senses are the starting point of all knowledge. So the way that we understand or gain knowledge about the world that we live in is based on things like taste, smell, sight, and this gives birth to the knowledge that we can then build on and construct as a result. And I think people like Locke were a key individual in kind of putting these ideas or these concepts forward. Now, this debate was counteracted with something called rationalism, which then argued that actually reason is the starting point for knowledge, and reason would be the idea that we have these categories already given to us by birth, which we can then build our concepts or our understanding of the world off. And I think Descartes would probably be one of the more famous rationalists. I don't know if you would agree with Descartes as being.
Yeah, definitely. Descartes, Leibniz, Spinoza, they're the key rationalist thinkers.
Absolutely. So we've got this debate going on in philosophy beforehand, and then Kant comes along with his Copernican revolution. Now, for those that don't know, Copernicus came up with the idea that the Earth revolves around the sun, whereas previously scientists and people had thought that it was the opposite, that actually the sun revolves around the Earth. And what Kant has done is he's more or less done the exact same thing as Copernicus has done, that actually the subject is the starting point of knowledge, that it is the mind that kind of understanding begins with, not that it is internal, not necessarily these outside concepts. And Hegel's very much building off these ideas from Kant, isn't that right, Sean?
Yeah, I think you have to see Kant as really the culmination of those two contrasting traditions. So I think it's also worth adding in that empiricism is very much the philosophy of the English-speaking world, whereas rationalism is really focused in France, but also in Germany. So you do have these two different traditions from the two different parts of Europe, and Kant does see himself as trying to resolve the contradictions between the two. So that the thing about the Copernican revolution is it brings together, in Kant's perspective, the senses and the mind in a way that Kant felt was satisfactory. And then just looking ahead to Hegel, Hegel is interested in the ways in which the Kantian system doesn't work.
It's interesting how he builds off kind of those concepts as well.
Yeah, I think the other thing that's worth saying, we can get onto this later on, but I think it's worth mentioning here, is that for Hegel, it's not saying, okay, one of these is right, empiricism right, rationalism wrong, or vice versa. The great thing about the Hegelian view, and this applies to this topic as well as everything essentially, is that within every notion and within every idea, there are positives and weaknesses, strengths and weaknesses, positives and negatives. So empiricism and rationalism together, they are a step forward on the traditional sort of static view of the world, the church-dominated view. Likewise, Kant is a step forward on empiricism and rationalism. But the Hegelian approach is about pulling out the strengths of these various viewpoints and then putting them together. But that might sometimes people think, okay, Hegel just equals a sort of eclecticism where you pick out the best bits of everything. But for Hegel, it's not about just picking out about the best. The key idea for Hegel, another key idea for Hegel is it's a strange word in English. You don't hear it very often, but it's the word sublation. Now, sublation means to bring together the strengths of different viewpoints, but to create something that is superior to all of them. So sometimes Hegel is misunderstood. Okay, let's just have a mishmash of empiricism, rationalism, and Kant. It goes beyond that. The concept of a synthesis is one that people often use when they talk about Hegel. So Hegel, in a sense, does synthesize empiricism, rationalism, and Kant. Some Hegelian commentators they think that the word synthesis actually doesn't do justice. So it's often this notion of sublation is sometimes preferred, but I think the word sublation is not a very common one in English.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a pretty good conception just in politics in general, particularly today. Particularly in online discourses, things are so vicious. But I guess if you're coming from a Hegelian perspective, it would be about taking the strengths of each of those arguments and I guess creating something new, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me that's one of the great appeals of Hegel is there's a sort of built-in tolerance to his way of thinking, is that no idea is ever cast aside. Within every sort of idea, there is a rational kernel, as Marx would put it. That there is an idea that you can use. So there is a sort of, I say this, that there's a breadth and a tolerance in an Hegelian view, which I think is, like you say, in the sort of the bile of social media that might be beneficial.
Yeah, absolutely. Going back to Hegel's philosophical background, then he's very much a product of the Enlightenment period, which we've discussed before, which is founded on these concepts of liberty, progress, reason, constitutional government, and of course separation of church and state. But I think Sean's articulated his connection to the Enlightenment quite well, that when you said Napoleon came in and he saw this as the French Revolution coming to Germany, or at least those values coming in, we can see how this huge event, or the ideas that spurned this event, will result in shaping his philosophy and his ideas that he's going to articulate later on in his work.
Yeah, that's right. And I think another idea that is still discussed even today is what's sometimes referred to as the dark side of the Enlightenment. In other words, the Enlightenment promised historical progress and promised equality and promised liberty and fraternity, but of course it didn't deliver it. So now we can maybe talk about this further on, but I think it's worth mentioning now is that Hegel was a huge supporter of the French Revolution and saw the French Revolution as the fulfillment of the Enlightenment. It was this idea that the scientific revolution, Galileo, Newton, Francis Bacon, that would deliver us the political ideas of people like Locke in terms of separation of powers and individual freedom. That would deliver a new sort of political settlement. But by the time Hegel gets to the phenomenology of spirit in 1806, it's apparent that the Enlightenment has not delivered, what was on the tin. So part of the Hegelian approach is to try and explain, in a sense, what went wrong with the Enlightenment, what went wrong with the French Revolution. So again, I think that is important context for his ideas.
Yeah, excellent. And then the other thing that we were going to discuss as well, which influences philosophy, is this concept of transition from feudalism to capitalism. Again, a huge historical change, which we've discussed before on the site relating to Marx. But I didn't know if you wanted to expand a little bit more on this. We've kind of covered quite a lot of the history in this sense. So obviously we've mentioned the French Revolution being hugely influential, the role of the Napoleonic Wars, but the rise of obviously industrialization and the market economy, the new conditions that this has created, Hegel's very much responding to. And we've also mentioned this is just before German unification, so the idea of Germany not being a unified state yet, it's fragmented. Which we've again been discussed before in the context of Nietzsche. But I didn't know if you wanted to add anything more to that kind of historical background.
I think something that's in the background of all that is really that's the birth of modernity. And I think for me, one of the best commentators on Hegel is an American scholar called Terry Pinkard. And Terry Pinkard says the thing about Hegel, one way to think about Hegel is that the self-grounding of modernity. In other words, previous thinkers, in some sense, always had a sort of a religious dimension to them. Hegel was interested in the world after the French Revolution. Amid the Industrial Revolution is a fundamentally different philosophical cultural experience where the old models we cannot use. So all these events were obviously hugely disruptive, and none of the previous sorts of philosophical frameworks could offer any sort of explanation. So then Hegel's ambition was to try and, in a sense, reset philosophy on the basis of these events. So these events were hugely culturally, psychologically, politically disruptive. And none of the old philosophical frameworks could provide any sort of explanation. So these are all essential backgrounds to Hegel, really the rise of capitalism, on the economic basis of capitalism, but then also the political aspects of capitalism, including things like liberal democracy. So Hegel, yeah, I think you can't really understand Hegel at all unless you situate him in really what is the rise of capitalism, from around about 1800. So you got the French Revolution as the political breakthrough of capitalism, and then the Industrial Revolution in England as the sort of economic breakthrough of capitalism. And Hegel was a great observer of contemporary events. I mean, the thing is that he celebrated the fall of the Bastille every day of his life, 14th of July, every day without fail. He'd raise a glass. And he was all, he's also very interested in. He understood England as the most economically advanced part of the world at the time. And he was very much interested in Adam Smith's idea of the hidden hand. But again, Hegel comes up with a very interesting critique of the hidden hand, because Hegel identifies something that today we take for granted, that actually capitalism brings a huge polarization of wealth. And although Hegel understood the technological progress of capitalism, he critiqued Adam Smith's hidden hand as saying that Smith has no answer for the inequalities of capitalism. Now, again, looking ahead to the further on, we'll talk about the Hegelian state. The Hegelian state is about regulating the market economy. And again, one very interesting parallel, I think, is between Hegel and Keynes, because over a century before Keynes, really, Hegel says you really need the state to regulate the market economy, because the market economy developing in England around about 1820, 1830s that Hegel was observing, that was obviously leading to the horrendous poverty in the English cities. And Hegel had already tuned into that. And, people like Smith had no answer for it, but Hegel did have an answer. Now, from our viewpoint, not a satisfactory one, but still one that was way ahead of its time, I think.
Absolutely. Very good. So I'm just going to press for time. So I'm going to just move on. And I wonder if you could just take us through this last bit, which is related to the idea of, well, the cunning of reason that you've mentioned, but also the owl of Minerva.
Okay, so the subtitle we've got is the myth of unreadability. And again, I think something that does put people off Hegel is that you can open a page of Hegel and you can read from the top to the bottom and you think, I haven't learned anything there. I'm not feeling very well. Flick over the page. Okay, same effect. So there is a caricature of Hegel as unreadable, and he is difficult. We're not trying to dodge that, but I think there's not enough focus on Hegel. Actually had quite a poetic turn of phrase, which does appear quite frequently in his texts. So the one about the owl of Minerva is this idea that is really the idea of hindsight, is we don't really understand what's happened until afterwards. Now, again, I think the context for this in terms of Hegel's experience was that the French Revolution, when it was going on, a huge amount of confusion, execution of the king, execution of the nobility, rise and fall of Robespierre, rise and fall of Napoleon. When you're living through it, doesn't really make any sense. But Hegel thinks the way to understand the French Revolution is when you're looking back. In some ways, it's a bit like, I think Kierkegaard had a famous expression that life has to be lived forwards but can only be understood backwards. This is a very similar idea. And it's also about the importance of history. Again, one of the things that makes Hegel almost unique as a Western philosopher is the first one to say that we have to think historically. So the owl of Minerva is really this idea of, if we reflect on how history has moved, we can actually make some sense of it. Then the famous quote about the only thing we learn from history is that we learn nothing from history. Well, again, yes, I suppose to be topical, why are we in this? Topical. Yeah, I think why are we in this horrendous mess? Because in 2016 the government had its own trial run of a potential pandemic and came up with a lot of suggestions that would have made sense, but the Johnson government just was not interested. So I think that's a very specific example.
Not just that, Trump even cut funding in the US for such pandemics because he didn't think it was going to happen.
That's right, yeah. So I think Hegel is a very sort of grand thinker. He was saying we should learn from history, but he obviously had a very scornful view of politicians, and they essentially don't learn from history.
Yeah, I think that was the key point I thought you were going to get at.
And then the final one is that now when we get on to logic, sometimes people think, okay, Hegelian logic really flies in the face of formal logic. Again, that's a simplification. Hegel does not reject formal logic. It basically just says it's inadequate for the sort of the breadth of the task ahead of us. So Hegel is saying that formal logic has its place in the same way that if you read an anatomical or a biological textbook, it will help you understand how your digestion system works, but it's not actually going to digest it for you. So it's this idea that theoretical knowledge has its place, but ultimately we have to engage on not just on a theoretical level, but in a much wider sense in order to try and not just understand the world, but to engage actively with it.
Absolutely. It almost links to that practicality that Marx discusses as well. Okay, so
yeah, exactly.
last one before we conclude, because I'm aware we are running out of time. So do you want to take us through the rose and the cross? I've seen this online quite a lot, actually, though. A lot of people have questioned this notion in Hegel and tried to dissect what it means.
Yeah, there's a lot of debate about this one. So there's not, the thing about Hegel is there's never, whatever I say is obviously not the truth. There are lots of interpretations. I mean, my interpretation of this one is basically, I suppose, in the Monty Python, always look on the bright side of life. No matter how bad things get, there is always something you can hold on to. So, the cross in the sense of being crucified and excruciating pain, but there is still something to hang on to. There is the rose in a sense. So that's what I take out of this one anyway. I mean, the one at the bottom, I think, is one of the great philosophical insults of all time. It might not strike you as hilarious when you first look at it, but one of Hegel's rivals, a guy called Schelling, and Schelling believed that ultimately really simplified, but Hegel believed that the subject or the self is really part of the universe, and we really just, on a high level, we just merge into it, and so we are not really distinct from the universe and for Hegel, that was just this sort of, it's the night in which all cows are black. In other words, our individuality basically disappears in Schelling's view of the universe. So this was a put down. Obviously, when I explain it, it's not funny.
Well, I'm laughing on the inside. I just didn't want to interrupt.
Okay.
I think that was a good introduction, that, Sean. So if we could just sum up the end of this one just very quickly. The end of this first part. Obviously, we're going to continue the second part in the next video. But the argument that we're trying to get across here is that essentially Hegel is more interesting bibliographically and philosophically than his current reputation, either online or his current reputation in some parts of the university. Because I do feel, particularly from my experience, that Hegel's been very much neglected as an individual in philosophy, even though he's always in the background, whether it's his ideas or people kind of passing off their ideas as his own. Another one is that Hegel's philosophical foundations are very much building off these concepts of the Enlightenment and the historical concepts that came with the Enlightenment. We've got this idea of, as Sean's eloquently put, which I think was quite a political argument, the idea that we learn nothing from history, or the tongue-in-cheek kind of retort that he has, that we learn nothing from history. And I think another key fact, we're going to come on to this in the next one, but another key thing that I think we didn't manage to mention, but this idea that everything is connected is what interests me about Hegel the most, personally. We didn't really cover it in this one, but we'll cover it more in the next one. But this idea of everything coming together in one unified theory, I think, is really a strength to what he has to say. Do you want to add anything to that, Sean?
Yeah, I think, now the last one about everything is connected, again, that might sound quite a religious sort of viewpoint. I think a lot of religions have this viewpoint, but I think the Hegelian approach is not going to be the same. It's going to be more about everything is connected, but in a sort of dynamic, restless sort of way. I think the other thing I'll just say finally is that many people actually do think in a Hegelian way without actually realizing it. Now, this point make a bit more sense in the second part. So I think, like you say, Reese, Hegel has a bad reputation. It's undeserved, and it's actually not helpful. I think people will find a Hegelian approach to a lot of problems will actually be beneficial.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for your expertise, Sean. You've been really good. and we'll see you in the next video. For everyone that's watched, you can see more from us on these links. So there's more videos on my WordPress account. And if you want to follow Counterfire as well, Sean writes there regularly. I've written some pieces too, but they also provide some good Hegelian-esque commentary almost on current events and topical events too. So if you want to like and subscribe to the video if you found this interesting, because the more people that subscribe, the more things we can actually do and the more content we can deliver. And we will see you in the next video. Thank you very much. And thank you again, Sean.
Thank you, Reese.